I'm going to be debunking the Hebrew Israelite belief that Deuteronomy 28 is talking about the transatlantic slave trade. To start proving this wrong, first we're going to go to Deuteronomy 28, starting at verse 58. It says, "If you are not careful to obey all the words of this law which are written in this scroll, by fearing this glorious and awe-inspiring name, the Lord your God, he will bring wondrous plagues on you and your descendants, severe and lasting plagues, and terrible chronic sicknesses." So he continues on talking about all these things that he's going to bring upon the people. As we scroll down and we see that this is a punishment for not obeying the words of this law, the law of Moses, everything from Genesis to Deuteronomy, more specifically everything from Exodus to Deuteronomy. So he says if you do not obey the words of this law, he's going to bring these curses upon you. When we scroll down to the part that the Hebrew Israelites like to use, we're going to start around verse 67. It says, "In the morning you will say, if only it were evening, and in the evening you will say, if only it were morning, because of the dread you will have in your heart and because of what you will see." Verse 68, "The Lord will take you back in ships to Egypt by a route that I said you would never see again. There you will sell yourselves to your enemies as male and female slaves, but no one will buy you." And this is the crux of the argument that we're going to be making today. The Hebrew Israelite movement here in America and across the world now teaches that in Deuteronomy chapter 28 verse 68, when he's talking about taking them back to Egypt by ships, it is referring to the transatlantic slave trade that happened in 1619. They say metaphorically Egypt is referring to America because the original Israelites of the Bible were slaves in Egypt and black people were slaves in America. They say that Egypt is a word that means bondage. We're going to see that this is very much so not true because he's actually talking about a literal Egypt. But before we do that, we're going to go up a little bit and we're going to read some prior verses so we get the context of what he's talking about. Because for the Hebrew Israelite doctrine to be true, he has to be saying that the people will be taken from the land of Africa and then shipped across the Atlantic Ocean to land in America, and there they will be sold as slaves. Now, if we go up to verse 52 of this chapter, he says about the invading forces, "They will besiege you within all your city gates, until your high and fortified walls that you trust in come down throughout your land. They will besiege you within all your city gates, throughout the land the Lord your God has given you." So as we're reading in context of what this is saying so far, he's saying that these foreigners, these people from another nation, will come into the gates of the Israelites, into their land, not into Africa, but into Jerusalem, into Israel, which was the land that the Lord had given the Israelites. This isn't talking about people being sieged while they're in Africa and then taken to America. He continues on in verse 57, "The afterbirth that comes out from between her legs," speaking about the woman who was nursing or the woman that was pregnant, "the afterbirth that comes out from between her legs and the child she bears, because she will secretly eat them for lack of anything else." This actually happened during certain circumstances. We'll cover that another time. It says, "During the siege and hardship your enemy imposes on you within your city gates." This is what I want to harp on during this particular moment. The fact that this is happening within their city gates, within their city, throughout their land. This is not talking about Africa. This is talking about Jerusalem. For once again, third time, right here in verse 63. It says, "Just as the Lord was glad to cause you to prosper and to multiply you, so he will be glad to cause you to perish and destroy you. You will be ripped out of the land you are entering to possess." You will be ripped out of the land you are entering to possess. What land were they entering to possess at this current point in time when Deuteronomy was written? They were entering into the land of Israel. They were going to Jerusalem. And this is what he's prophesying with these curses that they're going to be ripped out of, the land of Jerusalem, the land of Israel. They will be ripped out of there, and from that point, they will be sold as slaves in Egypt. Now we're going to read further, and we're going to see that this isn't talking about a metaphoric Egypt or a spiritual Egypt. This is talking about a literal Egypt. The Hebrew Israelites don't really know the Bible. They'll say this never happened before in history. It's only happened one time in history, and it didn't happen to any other people, and that was during 1619 with the transatlantic slave trade, when Africans were taken from the west coast of Africa and shipped across to America. We're going to show it's not true. We're going to use the same Bible that they believe. We're going to go to the third book of Maccabees, chapter 4. It says, wherever this decree was read, and we're going to go back just a little bit to find out what this decree was talking about. But before we do that, wherever this decree was read, a feast was arranged for the Gentiles at public expenses with shouts of joy. Their deep, long-standing hatred was now openly being revealed. So what is this decree that it's talking about? If we go back one chapter, we see that the decree is issued by Ptolemy Philopator. He was the king of Egypt during the Greek Empire. If you know your history, you know that Alexander the Great started the Greek Empire. When Alexander the Great died, he split his empire into 4 divisions, and one of the divisions was Egypt. And the Ptolemies, that line, ruled over Egypt. And right now we're specifically talking about Ptolemy Philopator. And the decree he issued is right here. See here. Verse 25. We have given an order that as soon as this letter arrives, you are immediately to send us to those Jews who live among you, together with their wives and children, to suffer a certain and shameful death appropriate for enemies. Treat them harshly and abusively, and bind them on all sides with iron chains. We are sure that when these people have all been punished, the affairs of our state will be established more securely in a more excellent condition for the future. But whoever shelters any of the Jews, from an elderly person to a child to nursing infants, will be tortured, household and all, with the most horrible punishments. So this is the decree that we just read about in chapter 4. So now going back to chapter 4, let's continue reading. Verse 2. But among the Jews there were constant grief, lament, and crying, and now we know why that would be the case. Everywhere their hearts were on fire as they groaned and bewailed the unexpected destruction that the king had suddenly inflicted upon them. What district or city or what inhabited place of any kind or what streets weren't filled with grieving and weeping for them? They were being sent off together by generals in every city in a merciless and cruel manner. We can also see this talked about in Deuteronomy 28, but I'm trying to stick to the point of the transatlantic slave trade right now. At the sight of these unusual punishments, even some of the Jews' enemies wept over their most miserable expulsion, for they saw their pitiable state and reflected on the uncertain outcome of life. A multitude of gray-haired, elderly men were being led away, bent over with age, their feet plodding along under the distresses of a forced, swift march, with no consideration given to their age. Young women who had just entered the bridal bedroom, for sharing of life, exchanged joy for weeping and sprinkled dust on their hair that was still wet with perfume. They were led away with their heads bare and began to sing a funeral song together in place of a wedding song. And they were roughly handled by cruel treatment of a foreign nation. Once again, you can see this directly outlined in Deuteronomy 28. I might go back at the end of this to point that out, but right now I'm trying to focus on what happened in the transatlantic slave trade and see if that fits the narrative. Verse 7. These captives were violently dragged away in public view to be put on board ship. Their husbands, in the prime of their youth, had ropes tied around their necks instead of festive garlands. They spent the remaining days of their wedding festivities weeping rather than celebrating and enjoying youthful amusements. Seeing the grave already yawning at their feet, they were driven like cattle, constrained by the power of iron chains. Some were fastened by the neck to the ship's benches. So we're talking about them being taken as slaves and put on ships. Some were secured by their feet with unbreakable shackles. Moreover, they were plunged into total darkness due to thick planks positioned above them, so that they would receive the treatment due receive the treatment due to traders throughout the entire voyage. These people When these people had been brought to a place called Scythia, the voyage was finished. Just as the king decreed, Ptolemy ordered the captives to be encamped on the outskirts of the city in the race course. This stadium had been built with an immense perimeter and was very well placed for providing a public spectacle to all those returning home to the city and those setting out from the city into the country for a trip abroad. So we're going to pause here. It says that these people were put in chains, iron chains. I'll highlight this for you guys. They were fashioned by the neck to the ship's benches. So chains, ships, and they were sent to a place called Scythia. Add this in here too. They're brought to a place called Scythia. Now right here on this map you see we have a map of this is the ancient synagogues in Egypt, but this is 280 BC before Christ. So around the time of the Greek captivity, we have Alexandria, Egypt right here, Cairo right here. You got the pyramids, little imagery of the pyramids, and the Sphinx. And then you have Scythia, Egypt. So these people were literally put in chains, put on ships, shipped across the Mediterranean from Israel, from Jerusalem, down to Scythia in Egypt. Not metaphorically, not spiritually. They were literally taken to Egypt by way of ship and sold as slaves, as we're going to continue reading. So picking up where we left off, the captives had no communication at all with the king's forces, nor were they considered worthy of protection of the city wall. When this was done, the king heard their fellow Jews were frequently going forth from the city in secret to express sympathy for the shameful misery of their kindred. He became very angry and gave an order to deal with these people in exactly the same thorough fashion as the others, not leaving out any part of their punishment. The entire tribe was to be registered by name, no longer for service of hard labor described earlier. So remember, they're supposed to be sold as slaves, but they're not going to be sold as slaves, but to be tortured with the prescribed punishments, and in the end, to be killed within a single day. So here we have Deuteronomy 28 exactly as it says. It says, verse 68, the Lord will take you back in ships to Egypt by a route that I said you would never see again. There you will sell yourselves to your enemies as male and female slaves, but no one will buy you. Here in 3rd Maccabees, you have them put in chains and then put on ships, put in chains, put on ships, taken down to Scythia, which is in Egypt, as we just showed you on this map. They were supposed to be sold as slaves, but once they got there, the king ended up changing his mind. He said, no, 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 these people will not be sold as slaves. Now I want you to torture them and to kill them. This is literally what Deuteronomy 28 says to the T. This happened during the Greek Empire under Ptolemy Philopator. Word for word, not a metaphor. The people were not taken from the west coast of Africa, nor were they taken from any other country. Just as the Bible says, they were besieged within their own city gates, within their own land. They were ripped out of the land they entered to possess in the old days. They had hardships imposed upon them in their own land, and they were sold by way of ships to Egypt as slaves. And when they got there, they were not bought as slaves, but instead they were put to death after being punished. We have more though. This is Josephus on the war the war between the Romans and the Jews. Book 6, as you can see, and we're going to go down to chapter 9, and we're going to see what Josephus has to say about the matter. So down here in chapter 9, this is what Josephus says, starting at 1. It says, "Now when Titus Vespasian, was come into this upper city, he admired not only some other places of strength in it, but particularly those strong towers which the tyrants in their mad conduct had relinquished. For when he saw their solid altitude, and the largeness of their several stones, and the exactness of their joints, as also how great was their breadth, and how extensive their length, he expressed himself after the manner following: We have certainly had God for our assistant in this war, and it was no other than God who ejected the Jews out of these fortifications. For what could the hands of men or any machines do towards overthrowing these towers? At which time he had many discourses with his friends. He also let such go free as he had bound as had been bound by the tyrants, and were left in the prisons. To conclude, when he had entirely demolished the rest of the city and overthrew its walls, he left these towers as a monument of his good fortune, which had proved his auxiliaries and enabled him to take what could not otherwise have been taken by him." So once again, this is going right back into what Deuteronomy 28 says. They were sieged within their city gates, in their own land. The enemy is imposing hardship on them in their own city gates. Here we have Titus literally marveling at the walls. He's marveling at the city gates. And he's saying, if we did not have God on our side, we could have not pulled this off. And according to Deuteronomy 28, it is the Lord who is sending armies against them. This is nothing new. The Lord is the one who sent Nebuchadnezzar against the Jews in the first place when they were first sieged and their first temple was destroyed. That was on behalf of the Lord God Almighty. He sent Nebuchadnezzar in. In the exact same manner, the Lord Jesus Christ has sent Titus Vespasian against the Jews in the year 70 AD to destroy their city and destroy their temple and to take them as slaves. It's the exact same thing that happened. In verse 2, section 2, chapter 9, Josephus, it says, "And now, since his soldiers were already quite tired with killing men, and yet there appeared to be a vast multitude still remaining alive, Caesar gave orders that they should kill none but those that were in arms and opposed them." So only kill the people that are fighting back. That's what Caesar said. But let's look what happened. "But should take the rest alive. But together with those whom they had orders to slay, they slew the aged and the infirmed." Anybody that was old or sick, they killed those people too. "But for those that were flourishing in age, who might be useful to him, they drove them together into the temple, and shut them up within the walls of the court of the women, over which Caesar set one of his freedmen, as also Fronto, one of his own friends, which last was to determine everyone's fate, according to his merits. So this Fronto slew all those that had been seditious and robbers, and who were impeached by one another. So anybody who was a criminal of the Jews were automatically put to death. But of the young men he chose out the tallest and most beautiful, and reserved them for the triumph. And as for the rest of the multitude that were above 17 years old, he put them into bonds and sent them into the Egyptian mines." So check that out. Once again, these people were sieged within their own city gates, within their own land. They were treated harshly by another nation, a nation that did not care about the old or the young. And then, after they are sieged, they are taken as slaves and sent to Egypt. This is the second time that this has happened. The first time happened in Maccabees under Ptolemy Philopator. The second time is happening under Titus Vespasian. Let's keep reading. "Titus also sent a great number into the provinces as a present to them, that they might be destroyed upon their theaters," which is talking about the Colosseums, tearing apart by the lions and random things like that nature, the gladiators, "by the sword and by wild beast. but those that were under 17 years of age were sold for slaves. Now during the days wherein Fronto was distinguishing these men, there perished for want of food 11,000, some of whom did not taste any food, through the hatred of their guards bore to them. And others would not take in any. When it was given them, the multitude was so very great that they were even in want of corn for their sustenance. So now we're going to go to the last instance where this happened. This is the second Jewish-Roman war. This time it's going to be happening under Hadrian. This is Munter, Primordia Ecclesia Africanae. You can find this book on Amazon. Munter is an ancient Roman historian. So he's a Roman. He has no accounts to be funny with the religious text or anything like that. He's just recording what happened in history, straight to the T. Now look how much this lines up with Deuteronomy 28. This is what Munter says. Now that Batar had been captured, everything came under human control, while Palestine, Judea, was reduced to a desolate mound. Captives were sold into slavery in numbers too great to count. First they were brought to the grand annual market at the Terebinth Elo tree in Hebron, or in the words of Hieronymus, to the tent of Ohel of Abraham near Hebron. Each slave sold for the price of a horse. Those captives who were not sold there were brought to the marketplace in Gaza, or Aza, which, because of the great multitudes of slaves who were sold there, was called Hadrian's marketplace. And those who were still not sold there were herded into ships and were taken to Egypt. Many died in transit, whether by starvation or by shipwreck, while many also were killed by cruel masters. There you have it. 3 times in history, you have it under the Greek captivity or the Greek Empire by Ptolemy Philopator, taken into ships as slaves, sold in Egypt as slaves, but when they got there, the king changed his mind and they were not actually sold as slaves, they were rather put to death. Then you have Josephus accounting that they were sold as slaves or taken down to the Egyptian mines under Titus Vespasian. And then the last time you have Munter, a random Roman historian, who says the exact same thing. Under the Second Roman Jewish War, under Emperor Hadrian, they were taken as slaves, put on slave ships, and sent down to Egypt. All 3 accounts, every single time that this happened, they are taken out of their land. They are not taken out of Africa. They are taken out of their land. They are shipped across the Mediterranean Ocean or the Mediterranean Sea, and they are taken down to the literal Egypt, not a metaphorical Egypt, not a spiritual Egypt, not America in the future 2,000 years later. They are taken down to literal Egypt, and they are sold as slaves, or put to work as slaves, or put to death even though they were supposed to be slaves, by way of ship. The Hebrew Israelite doctrine does not hold any water. It does not hold any weight. It does not stand, because these events that the Lord is describing in Deuteronomy 28 literally took place. Now, Hebrew Israelites, because they're emotionally attached to this, and not just emotionally, but they have their identity attached to this as well, they're still going to deny this and say, well, if this happened back then it can happen again, because obviously the curses repeat themselves. But if the curses are repeating themselves, logic would tell you that they would repeat themselves in the same way. And if they're repeating themselves in the same way, then they would repeat themselves the way the Lord described. You would be besieged in your land, not in Africa. You would be besieged in your gates, not in Africa. You would be stripped from your land, not Africa. You would have hardships imposed upon you within your gates, not Africa, and you would be taken back to the literal Egypt, as it happened not 1 time, not 2 times, but 3 times, as it is recorded in history. This is the first of many lessons debunking the Hebrew Israelite doctrine. Please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for tuning in.